Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer. Continuing our candidate series today, we have a candidate who is running for Secretary of State and going for the Republican endorsement in doing so. We have some challenges in getting to this seat, but we have a guy who I think is equipped for the job, John Howe.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
You announced a few weeks ago.
Correct.
How has it been so far?
Great. The response has been fantastic. Matter of fact, I just came from the Capitol right over to here, and getting a lot of people to sign on to support me, and looking forward to a very good race.
For those of our audience who may not know you, John, can you give us a little background on who you are, where you've been, what qualifies you for the position of Secretary of State?
Sure. I grew up in western Minnesota, out by Morse, Minnesota, a little town called Shikio. If you looked at it, you'd think it was spelled Chokio, but it's Shikio, Minnesota. It's out in that little hump of Minnesota, the western border there. Grew up on a farm out there. Went to school for criminal justice at St. Cloud State, and as a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, I graduated with my master's degree in criminal justice. So I had a
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I received a Bachelor of Arts there in criminal justice, worked for the Department of Corrections, and then went traveling with Sears. And I ended up spending about 30 years with Sears. I've spent 10 years on the corporate side doing loss prevention and security, and then about 20 years owning my own independent small Sears stores, kind of like the dealer stores. Mm-hmm. And so it was very good. And of course, then there's this little online company that came along. I think they start with A, but we won't mention them, no. But anyhow, the retailing has gotten really tough, and I will always say that you should support your local people because they're the ones that donate to the cancer events, the little leagues, and all those things. And so, but it was a great experience. Did very well with the Sears organization, and when I transitioned from the corporate side. When Sears restructured, I ended up taking a caseworker's position in corrections down in Red Wing. And then I ended up opening a Sears store in Red Wing, and I've been there 23 years. So I met my wife in 1989. We have 3 children. Our oldest son is in his 3rd year at Arizona State. Our middle child is at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs as a cadet, and then our youngest child is in the public school system in Red Wing.
From a resume perspective, mayoral experience, you're a state senator, you ran for Congress.
Sure.
Why Secretary of State? Why now?
Well, the Secretary of State is such an important office, and I feel it's been used as for partisan politics in the past. The DFL's been in control of the Secretary of State's office now for over a decade, and we can point to several incidents where it's used for partisan, and I believe it should be used nonpartisan. I think it should be, you should have somebody with the highest integrity in that office. My experience as mayor, I think it's very important to have local government experience. It certainly helped me when I became a state senator. I like to tell people when they think about who to vote for, I passed a yellow flashing arrow, so I see there's one right here by the studio. So if you come to a stoplight, I was the chief author of the bill that contained the yellow flashing arrow, where you come to a stoplight, if you want to make a left-hand turn, you don't have to wait for the whole traffic signal to cycle. You can just make a left-hand turn, and it saves you time and energy. But I also think having that private business experience will really help me in the Secretary of State's office, and it's such a vital office. Everybody sees it, of course, with the elections and the voter integrity issues, and that's certainly an important aspect, but also there's a big, huge part of it that has to do with business registrations and business filings and things of that nature.
Yeah, the way you search for businesses and that kind of thing. I know we had to do a lot of that when I started my little business too. Everything runs through you as
right, absolutely.
Secretary of State. One thing I find really interesting about this race in particular is it's the discrepancy between, hey, when we last had somebody who would self-identify as a Republican in office, it's not as dramatic as Attorney General. We had Doug Wardlow on a few months ago. Why do you think somebody like Steve Simon, how does he get so embedded into a position like this?
Well, I'd prefer not to mention my competitor's name, just because most people don't even know who the Secretary of State
That's right.
person is. If you
And that's really my point, John.
But I don't know his business background. I know he was a former legislator, and I think it is important to have some legislative experience so you understand how it. But when it comes down to the election cycle, and I can tell you, one of the things I'll certainly address is voter integrity, also campaign finance issues. We really don't have any teeth in our campaign finance laws, and I think we really need to have somebody that is in a constitutional office that's going to make that an issue. In 2012, we had, I believe it was 12 DFL state senators that violated the campaign coordination law. Of those 12, 11 became sitting senators. They violated. The DFL paid a $100,000 settlement, of course admitting no wrongdoing, but paid a $100,000 settlement. Let's not call it a fine or a penalty, but a settlement.
Yeah.
And they got to keep their seats. And that switched the majority. And in that year, in that election cycle, the Republicans lost the House, the Senate. And if I'm the Secretary of State, I'm going to take a position, if you cheat on your election, you lose your seat. You're going to face immediate re-election, an immediate special election. Today, you violate the campaign finance laws, you might face a civil penalty. That's wrong. We need to address it. And it's the same thing with ineligible voters. Max, we have 63,000 people in our state that are either incarcerated, on parole, or on probation. Those are ineligible voters. Now, we can have a discussion of whether or not that should be the case. Maybe somebody that's on probation and we want to get them back in society should be allowed to vote. Those are questions for the legislative body, and we need to change state law. But as a Secretary of State, I'm going to enforce the current law and say ineligible voters will be prosecuted.
The classic kind of Democrat retort to that you hear all the time is, well, there's not that many cited examples of voter fraud. How do you even respond to that? Because it seems so obvious to me, but I obviously have a certain...
Right. Well, there's two things. One, you do have illegal voting going on, and you need to address that. But more importantly, you also have that perception. And if you're not addressing not only the violations and making sure that people are prosecuted so you have a deterrence value there, when someone thinks that their vote is going to be taken out by somebody who is improperly voting, that has to do with the perception and the validation of the elections and things of that nature. So it is really important to people, and I can just tell you that I will enforce the laws, I'll improve voter integrity, and there's a whole host of things that we can do to address some of those.
With these constitutional offices, there's always this balance of making sure you fulfill your campaign promises as you run for them.
Sure.
And not overstepping your bounds into the legislative process.
Right.
How do you inherently view your role as Secretary of State? My
role is to enforce the current laws that are on the books. We do have some federal election responsibilities too. After the 2000 election, they passed the Help American Vote Act, and that was to improve some of these outdated machines, especially the card punch machines that they had down in Florida, and so to improve that. And I think you'll see they allocated like $380 million this year to deal with cybersecurity and things of that nature. Now, our state is one of the few states, I think there's 46 states that actually have provisional balloting. We're one of the few states that do not have that. And again, that's in my role. My job is to go to the legislative body and say, hey, these are some of the things that we can either do to improve the election. My job is to enforce the laws that they pass. It isn't to go off on my own and do something. It's to inform that part of the body of what we can do to improve it. Now, the Minnesota's been allocated about $6.5 million for improvement of voting machines and securities and things of that nature. The legislative body has to vote to allocate that money. The Secretary of State can't do anything with it like in many states they could.
Okay.
I've heard there's a plan for that money. I don't know what that plan is. I'd like to see that plan other than just to spend it.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be spent wisely. And of course, we have certain organizations in our state that are very in tune to the voter issue. I'd encourage people to go to mnvoters.org. That's the Minnesota Voters Alliance, and you can educate yourself about some of these issues.
I always get nervous when lawmakers say they have a plan.
Yeah, and not show it to you.
Right.
So
it creates an interesting conundrum. The fact that you have to campaign for this position on I'm going to enforce the laws that already exist.
Right.
When you're running for governor, you have a bully pulpit. When you're running for a legislative position, you can make potential promises about what you're going to try to spearhead. John, as you look at your campaign projecting out to November here, where do you see your path, one, and then how do you convince people to vote for you based on a message of I'm going to enforce the laws that we currently have in place? It's not the quote-unquote sexiest message.
No, and I would also say that I won't be taking any special lobbyist or special money. The current Secretary of State has taken special interest money, and I don't care how much it is. I don't think you want your Secretary of State to take special interest money. I think if you're going to be issuing business licenses and in charge of making sure liens and other things are recorded properly, and certainly you're in control and have a big impact in how the elections are processed and done with integrity. I would just tell people to look at my record, look at my background coming from the private sector, look at my criminal background. I have no criminal record, and I think integrity is high. I'll take the job very seriously. When I served in the Minnesota Senate, I was there for each day of the session, and also my record as being in local government. So I think my private sector, local government experience, and I know Secretary of State isn't a top ticket election office, but it's so vitally important. And when somebody says, who's running for Secretary of State, you need to say it's not who, it's how.
Right.
But I think I bring so much to the table, and I'm very excited for the opportunity to improve our election integrity and also ensure that when somebody does violate it, that we are going to take steps. I'm also going to work very hard to put teeth into our campaign finance laws, so if you cheat, you don't get to keep your seat. And I think there's a lot of things that we can improve upon. The Secretary of State's website has a great online presence, and we need to continue to do that with the shift in technology. And certainly, we need to make sure that when you cast a ballot, I want every eligible voter to vote, and I will encourage that.
Every eligible.
That's the key.
Eligible voter. You ran for Congress in 2016.
Yes.
This is going to be a statewide election. Do you feel like you are able to take any lessons away from that experience into this campaign?
Absolutely, Max. It's great when you win an election. I've won an election. I've lost an election, and I know how that feels too. You got to keep a positive attitude, a can-do attitude, and learn from what's happened. And I think persistent pays off, and you get your name out there, and people know who you are. I'm hoping that some of the things that I did in the state senate will help with my name recognition, because that's what it's about. You need to make sure you have somebody who's capable and integrable to be able to do the job, but you also have to carry that name recognition out there. And certainly, it also matters who's our governor candidate, who's our Senate candidate. So, we are going to be in that down line, but you can, even if the top of the ticket doesn't win, you can come out and win. And so I'd encourage people to go to my website. It's soshow.com. and learn about me, and certainly you can email me at email@johnhowe.us, and that's just email at JOHNHOWE.us, and I'll certainly respond to any questions that are asked of me. And when we run a campaign, I just don't like people that just speak in, platitudes and don't answer the question. So many times you'll get into a campaign and somebody says, "Well, great question, Max. That's a great question. You're so intuitive and so smart to ask that question. Where are you from?" That's going to be one of the toughest questions we need to tackle. They never answer the question, and that's really difficult.
That was a great impression.
Yeah, people just love those answers, but it isn't. How do you feel about this? What would you do here? And so those are the concrete questions that I'll be answering if somebody asks me a question on it. I'm not afraid to dive into that.
You jumped into the race a little bit late. What led to that decision? What's the thought process going into that?
A year ago, I thought about running. I reached out to the state party, and I was totally fine with supporting somebody else if they needed to. If there was somebody passionate to run, I am passionate about the position. I ran for this office 4 years ago. Dan Steverson beat me, and I abided by the endorsement and the state endorsement process that we had in Rochester, Minnesota, that time, and so I know what it takes to run a statewide campaign. I believe I bring a lot of credibility to this race. I think we have a really good ticket as far as the constitutional offices are concerned, and I think that if we can select a good candidate at the top of the ticket and for the U.S. Senate races, I think we have a really good shot. We have the opportunity to really improve our election system, to bring the integrity, to make sure it's not going to be used for partisan politics, and I hope that that the state of Minnesota will give us an opportunity to do that.
Getting back to that, you mentioned that the current office holder does, from your perception, use it for partisan politics. Have you seen any kind of tangible examples? Is it just shirking the law that's in place, or can you think of anything anecdotally, John?
Just recently with the President's Commission on Election Integrity, when he asked for certain data. Now, there was some data that couldn't be given. I agree that there's some data that couldn't. But certainly, I think if it would have been a different president asking for that information, all the data that the Secretary of State's office could have legally given to the president would have been given it to him. When I was a state senator and there was a president that wasn't a Republican in office that came into my district, I certainly went and visited with him. I certainly went there. I think you have to respect the office. You have to respect certain things, and it shouldn't matter whether they've got an R behind their name or a D behind their name. Your responsibility is, and certainly right now the Secretary of State is facing a couple of legal challenges, even Supreme Court challenges with the release of some ineligible voter data. Certainly they'll release all the eligible voter data, but they won't release the data that shows the ineligible voters. And that's just a decision that the Secretary of State's made, rather than just allowing the public data that has been gathered to be out there so people can investigate and analyze it and see where we can improve the system.
To that end too, John, one of the biggest things that you hear about every kind of federal election cycle, when we have the president running or what have you, you start to hear about the integrity of the voter rolls. I'm wondering, what, if anything, do you control as the future secretary? Well, let's put you in the Secretary of State. Let's put you in that seat. The number one thing that we hear about from fraudulent voting is, hey, for whatever reason, we've had this person dead for a decade, and all of a sudden they have voted in every primary and they voted in every general election.
Like in Chicago, they got 8 votes.
Vote twice before breakfast, right? What power do you have as Secretary of State to make it more transparent or to clean up those rolls at the statewide level?
A couple things. One is we need to improve our state law. So one thing is that the Secretary of State's office is really going to have to work with the legislative body to see. Right now, it's really hard to convict somebody of illegal voting, because you have to basically say, I knowingly voted in that election, I knowingly did it wrong. And I think there's a lot of people that vote that don't realize they're not eligible to vote. And the other thing is, our law says wherever you consider your home to be. So if you're a college student here from Iowa, and you have an Iowa driver's license, and you go back to the farm and, you know, back home to the farm in Iowa for Christmas and Thanksgiving and everything else, what do you, Max, consider your home? If you consider your home the farm in Iowa, you can't vote here. But if you consider the dorm room at the University of Minnesota your home, you're legal to vote here. So it is really interesting. It's what you consider. It's so subjective. There isn't anything in the law other than what you consider as your home is where you can vote. And so there's a lot of things that we need to tighten up. So it's very subjective. And again, like I said, my role is to encourage every eligible voter to vote.
Right.
I want everybody to vote, but I want them to be eligible. And I think there's a lot of people that don't understand what the rules even are. And so there's an educational process to this too.
And it sounds like in some of these cases, you almost have to act from your perspective as a legislative influence or some kind of bully pulpit if you see broken processes.
Absolutely. And that's where I think you really need somebody that has that private business background to help, also with some government. I've got the local government plus the state level government experience that'll help. So I know how the laws get passed. I know how we can improve the system, and certainly I'll work very hard, and there certainly will be a learning curve. I know there's things that I need to learn, and that's one of the great things about public service. I encourage, Max, everybody to get into public service because you learn so much, and it is about how you educate yourself. It was interesting at graduation 2 weeks ago at St. Cloud State. A younger gentleman sitting next to me says, "Well, how old are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm 54. He says, "Aren't you a little old to be getting a master's degree?" And I said, "No, I've put a lot of effort into it. I want to finish it." And he said, "What are you going to do with a master's degree?" And I said, "Well, I'm kind of hoping to become a secretary." And he said, "A secretary?" and he started laughing. I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm running for Secretary of State." So nice. I do believe that I have what it takes, and I'm going to work very hard, and I hope I can get enough votes to win that office.
Yep. You ran for the seat 4 years ago.
Yeah.
We've been having governor candidates in and kind of talking about what they have seen from a change perspective. The electoral map in Minnesota in 2006 looks basically nothing like it does now, at least in the 2016 election. Right. What about this seat, John, encourages you to run for it? What makes you feel like statewide you do have a chance at this thing?
Well, I think some of the things that have happened under the DFL control, some of the lapses that we've had in our government as far as integrity and as far as watching where the taxpayer dollars is spent, I think most people, whether they want to identify themselves as liberals or independents, Democrats or Republicans, I think most people are fiscal conservatives. They want to make sure wherever their money is being spent, their tax dollars are being spent, that it's paying dividends, that you're getting a bang for the buck. Now, our current Secretary of State was just recently had a public session where public speaking session where we talked about the need for the $6.5 million, that he needed it right away to address cybersecurity and everything else. And he made the comment that not one penny of this $6.5 million is going to put a burden on Minnesota taxpayers. Not going to add one penny of burden to Minnesota. Now, there again, where do you think federal money comes from?
Right.
It comes from us. And it's disappointing when you see somebody say, well, these are federal dollars.
Of course.
Now, Minnesota puts a lot more money into Washington, D.C. than we receive back from Washington, D.C. So, yes, the $380 million that the Election Assistant Commission has placed out here under the Help America Vote Act, that is Minnesota money. That is Minnesota taxpayer bread. And don't get me started on the deficits that we have, because I can talk until I'm blue in the face about how we need to address the huge deficits that we're facing, and we need to take steps to do that right away. That's a federal issue, and thank goodness that at least the state has to balance their budget, even though there are some, games played with the, year out on the budgets, the tails that come in and cause us a deficit down the road 4 or 5 years. But at least we have to balance our budget today.
Right.
And so I wish we had to do that at the federal level, that would be a really big step in the right direction.
It is always an interesting justification, and you hear it all the time with the Southwest Light Rail specifically, because the Trump administration, it looks like they're going to put the kibosh on funding it, and then you hear about, well, now we're going to have to foot the rest of the bill, you guys. Well,
Right.
we were footing the bill anyway.
Absolutely, absolutely. Federal money is
pie.
not free. It comes from taxpayers. And so-
Talking about taxpayers and the responsibility to
Yeah.
them in a constitutional office and in almost an executive position, a lot of these gubernatorial candidates talk about cutting waste, fraud, abuse
Yes.
from the government. When Doug Wardlow came in, he talked about it with the Attorney General office. John, do you see from the front end any opportunity within your office to reduce cost or make it more efficient in any form or fashion?
I'm going to look at all those things, Max, when I become the Secretary of State. But I would also say that the voter rolls, we can also cross-reference those against some of the generous entitlement programs in our state and address where people may be having duplications, and certainly we need to look at duplications in our voter registration rolls, but also duplications when it comes to, you've seen what has been on the news lately with the daycare fraud and things of that nature. And so I think there really is, that's why I get back to talking about, I think everybody's a fiscal conservative. We want to make sure that we're getting the bang for our buck on our tax dollars. And it's not enough to just say, hey, give me the money, all right? I've got a plan for this money. I need to know what that plan is and how we're going to ensure that we're taking care of the cybersecurity, how we're improving the voting machines, and where we can vote by mail. And I would just, encourage the voters to know that, we have early voting in Minnesota. So for the primaries, that's going to start June 28th, and you can vote right up until the day before the election. And then for the general election, that'll start, I believe it will be September 21st. And you can vote right up to Election Day, early voting. And we want to get as many people and as many eligible voters as we can to vote. I want us to have high voting standards. I want us to have high voter turnout, but I also want to ensure that we have voter integrity.
Very good. John, with the last minute we have in our program, what is your pitch to the voters of Minnesota? Both, we have the convention coming up, June 1st and 2nd, talking to the delegation, and then beyond that going into November.
Well, I'm going to get out to all corners of the state, all around. I know what it takes for a statewide campaign. It is about name recognition, so if you're out there talking to somebody, you can, if you're sitting at a stoplight and you see a yellow flashing arrow, you can say, the guy that passed that yellow flashing arrow is running for Secretary of State. Who's that? It's not who, it's how. And I'd encourage you to go to my website, soshow.com, and my email is email@johnhowe.us, and I'll certainly respond to you if you send me an email. And I'm excited for the race. I think we have a great chance at winning. And Max, I really appreciate you having me on the program.
John, thank you so much for coming on. We'll see you at the convention.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I'm Max Reimer. This has been the Republican Roundtable. Until next time.